Are we ready? Okay. 2020 has really been quite a year. We couldn't have anticipated it, but we will all remember what it was like. At church, we will remember that this is the year that Prince of Peace had our 65th anniversary. And it has been quite a journey. Let's start over. Can we start over? Why in the world did I say 35th?
Don't worry about it.
Okay, starting over. Ready? Okay. 2020 has been quite a year. We couldn't have anticipated it, but we all will remember what it was like. At church, we can remember that it was the anniversary of our 65th year at Prince of Peace. It has been quite a journey. We are thankful that God has blessed us with this many years, and we want to celebrate His presence in the past and His presence as we go forth in the future in ministry. Because of the pandemic, we're not going to be able to gather as a group to celebrate this milestone. But with that in mind, it was decided that we should record some of the memories of our members. It will be fun to have this documentation. Here to talk to us today about the ministry at Prince of Peace is our dear friend Frank Jennings. He and Sandy have been active in leadership at Prince of Peace since they joined the church in 1961. Frank has a great memory, and he has consented to share some of those memories with us today. Some of you have submitted questions, and we will start with those today. But I have a feeling this is going to be an ongoing project, and that many of you will have memories that you'll want to share. So, Frank, tell us about your first Sunday at Prince of Peace.
Well, first of all, Julie, it's so good to see you. We are almost next door neighbors, and I haven't seen you this year even, because I left for Arizona right after Christmas, and so this is the first time we've seen each other in 11 months. My story doesn't start in this pew. I only moved up here in recent years when both the hearing and the eyesight were no longer what they used to be. Mm-hmm. My story starts in about the fourth pew on the lectern side behind us. In those days, the pews were straight, as you recall, and we didn't have cushions either. Mm-hmm. But it was a Sunday morning in February of 1961. Sandy and I and our then little one-year-old daughter, Chris, came here to Prince of Peace on a Sunday morning. We had just moved back here. We had been in Fargo, North Dakota for 2.5 years while I was completing my university education there. We had been married at Kent Lutheran, which was Sandy's home church 2.5 years earlier. When we were living in Fargo, I was raised in the Presbyterian Church, and Sandy, lifelong Lutheran. When we were in college, we would go to the Presbyterian Church, we'd go to the Methodist Church, and we'd go to several of the Lutheran churches in the Fargo-Moorhead area. So when we moved here, we found a home in the Gregory Heights area of Burien, and we decided the same thing. Let's search and find what will be our church home. So I remember in January of 1961, the first church we went to was Lake Burien Presbyterian. I remember that after that we went to the Methodist Church on First Avenue. And I recall that we went to Glendale perhaps a couple of times. We then looked in the Yellow Pages, and we discovered Prince of Peace Lutheran Church, 8th Avenue and 192nd. Well, since we were living in Gregory Heights, that wasn't really our neighborhood, so we hadn't driven by this church. So we came here on that Sunday morning, lectern side, fourth or fifth pew from the back, and Pastor Orth was our pastor, and in his opening announcements that morning, he said, at the end of the service today, we're going to commission our visitors. And Sandy and I looked at each other, what have we gotten ourselves into? But anyway, the service went on, and we really enjoyed the service. And I remember toward the end, we looked at each other, and we both at the same time went thumbs up. Excuse me? We had found our church home. In about 3 months, that'll be 60 years, and we're still here. Well, anyway, when the service concluded, Pastor Orth announced then, he said, now I would like all of the evangelism visitors to come forward. So then Sandy and I knew what commissioning visitors was all about. Lo and behold, I would say 40 people went to the altar, and they were commissioned for evangelism visitation that very day. And they were mostly teams of 2, mostly husbands and wives. And they were each given up to 5, maybe as many as 10 3x5 cards. And these 3x5 cards had names and addresses and phone numbers of people in the general area, maybe a 5 to 10 mile radius of Prince of Peace. And they were commissioned to spend that afternoon then visiting these people. And about 6 o'clock in the evening, they all came back to the church, and they shared all of their stories and enjoyed pie and ice cream together. And the purpose of the visitation was to invite people to come to pastor's class, which was going to start maybe on Thursday of that week. And I would say as many as 30 or 40 people probably responded saying they wanted to come to the class. And but we had not, they didn't have a card on us because we were brand new, but we did fill out a visitor card that day. And lo and behold, the very next night, or maybe Tuesday night, our doorbell rings, and here was Herb Lammert, who was our seminary intern that year, inviting us to come to pastor's class. And so that really started it for us. Sandy was a baptized member of a Lutheran church, and she could have just transferred. But since I was a Presbyterian, I needed to go through the equivalent of confirmation. And so we attended those classes for 3 or 4 weeks and became members then in early of 1961. And like I say, in about 3 months, that will have been 60 years, and we're still here. That visitation program went at least twice every year, and sometimes I think as many as 3 times a year. And it was really the reason why the membership of this congregation grew so fast. Something I saw across my desk yesterday, Julie, came from 1964. And that was only our 9th year as a congregation, and we had already grown to 1,476 members. But get this, of those 1,476 members, 726 were adults, and 600 and some were children. Compare that to what this community looks like this day and what this congregation looks like this day. So it truly was different. There was no Mariners, there was no Seahawks, there was no youth weekend tournaments. And there were so many transplants from the Midwest who had really been raised in Lutheran churches in the Midwest. So this church grew very rapidly in those years. on the new membership Sunday, we always ended it then by having a dinner.
Big dinner.
And we would do it at local restaurants, but you will remember Pastor Oddix, his favorite place was a buffet or a smorgasbord on 152nd.
I do remember that.
It wasn't the King's Table on 160th, but it was on 150. I can't remember the name, but he loved that place. So we would have these big dinners with all of the new members, and other members of the congregation would come and speak that evening. And so that was a wonderful evangelism program that went on for quite a few years, and it really was the reason why the membership grew so fast in this congregation.
Yeah.
Julie, I remember 3 or 4 years later maybe that you were on one of those visitation teams. You and a friend of yours, I believe it was Jeannie Denoff Nisted. And I know you went out and made a call, and that person decided to come to the pastor's class and became a member. Will you tell us something about who that special person was?
Yeah, that was quite a Sunday, because usually I went calling with my dad because he did all the talking, and Mother was in the office. But they went to Hawaii, so Jeannie and I made these calls, and it was on art. And so he was a lifelong Lutheran as well, but hadn't affiliated, and so he signed up for the pastor's class. We had a really wild and crazy and fun young adult group then, and so he became a member of that, and then that was in fall of '66, and we were married in July of '68.
Yeah.
So it was pretty pivotal for us. But yeah, good memories.
Oh, that was wonderful. Just maybe a couple of stories of how connections start and how they last. We were new to the community, didn't know anyone, and we needed a babysitter. And so we had been here at Prince of Peace maybe 2 or 3 Sundays by then. So Sandy called the church office, and it was at noon hour, and it turned out that your mom, Jenny, was the volunteer fill-in at the noon hour. And Sandy introduced herself and said that we were in need of a babysitter, and might she be able to help us recommend someone. And she says, well, my oldest daughter is doing babysitting. Well, Julie, you know what happened. You became our very first babysitter.
Yeah, oh gosh.
And then, in fact, I think the day that Terry was born, which was later that year, my mom was here visiting, and she was home with Chris, but I think we had you come and stay with my mom and Chris while I took Sandy to the hospital. Well, then 3.5 years later, we moved to this community, just 4 blocks south of here in the North Hill area. And we needed a babysitter that was closer by. Well, we lived only 2 blocks from the Scartland family home. And so we had met the Scartlands by then, and so we called, and lo and behold, Signe became our new babysitter. Yeah. That's Signe Scartland, Signe Fowler. And of course, Signe's still here 60 years later. When we bought our home here, we were in the backyard with the real estate person looking over, and lo and behold, on the fence on the other side here was Paul Schumacher. Well, lo and behold, we bought that house, and Paul and Doris and Sandy and I, for the next 20 years, raised our families together across the fence 4 blocks south of here. And Paul is still here.
Yeah.
So isn't it wonderful how these connections get started and last forever, it seems.
Yeah,
so,
it is. Yeah. There's something about that church community that stays strong through the years, isn't there? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there really is. Well, you and Sandy did a lot in leadership capacities, Frank, and so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, or about the celebrations we had that you led, and things that were special to you during those times, because there were lots of things that were special to us because of your leadership, actually. So if you could share with that, that'd be great.
Maybe a little more on the evangelism.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I think,
I'm sure there's some more.
The evangelism teams, that went on for several years, but then we moved to a different kind of program where we brought in a guest speaker for a whole week of services, all 5 nights, and then again on Sunday morning. And we had some people in the congregation who were wonderful about getting free advertisements.
Yeah.
And it would be advertised in the 2 Seattle papers, in the Tacoma paper, in the Kent News Journal, in the Highline Times. And we ended up getting a lot of visitors from the community coming to those nightly services. And we had some wonderful speakers that came in. In fact, 2 of them we ended up calling to become pastors of the church, but I might say neither one of them accepted the call. Well, it was maybe a little different than that. One, of course, was Len Erickson, who was a wonderful pastor at Central Lutheran in Bellingham. And he and Betty came and spent a week here with us, and those services were just wonderful. When it came time for us to call a new pastor, and I forget what the sequence might have been, but we ended up issuing a call to Len. And but Len and Betty's children were in high school, and it was just the wrong time for them to move their family. And so he returned our call. Then another one that we had was Tom Householder. And Tom at that time was in a large church in Chicago, Edison Park Lutheran Church. And so we had Tom and his wife come out and interview, and he was from Alaska, and he liked the Pacific Northwest. And he pretty well said when he left that if you call me, I will come. Well, and we were so delighted with that response that there was no doubt we were going to call him. But on his way back to Chicago, he stopped at Mayo Clinic for an exam, and he discovered that he had Parkinson's disease. And so it just wasn't right for him then to accept the call. And he continued on for a while in that large church and then moved to a smaller church in Kansas City. And sadly died at a fairly young age from the Parkinson's disease. But we always set our heights so high when it was coming to calling new pastors. We not often got our first choice because they were so good. I remember when Pastor Orth decided to, he and Maisie decided to move to Ohio to become the missions director for the Ohio district of the ALC. We knew of a wonderful pastor in Port Angeles, and I can't recall his name now, but we called him, and he decided to stay in Port Angeles. And we had another pastor that we called and likewise returned our call. Well, then Dr. Siefkes, who was the district president in those days, he brought a name to us, and it was a member of his staff. Well, that person ended up to be Pastor Onyx. And you know how wonderful that turned out? And Pastor Onyx had a history with our congregation because he was the mission director for the North Pacific District, and he had been a part of the team that had purchased this property from the Free family, the orchard and a few acres and the family home. And so he knew all about us. Well, Pastor Onyx was such a dear soul, and was, and I think to this day is the only pastor that actually retired from our congregation. And oh, what a wonderful time
Oh,
that
I
was.
think that was, yeah.
We had so much fun planning his retirement. And I remember Guy Overstreet was on our committee, and we ended up renting the gymnasium at Highline College for the event, and therefore we had the meal there too. And Guy, you would normally have ham or chicken or something like that for a meal. Guy insisted that we have brisket of beef. Well, our committee, they weren't too excited about brisket of beef, but he ended up winning anyway.
Prevailing.
Well, it turned out to be wonderful because he had this incredible recipe for brisket of beef. And I remember that Norma Dolan and Glenda Schultz were
Right.
members of or they were on the Highline dining room staff in those days. And so they were the two that were busy cooking all of this brisket of beef to feed 3 or 4 or 5 or 600 people, however many came to the retirement. It was just a wonderful retirement party we had for H.M. and Bert. Brought their whole family in from different places, including John and Mary, who were living in Denver in those days. You remember that H.M., he loved to play golf, and he had 2 holes in one. One was really verified, and the other one, the only person who saw him do it was Bobby Zacharias,
Oh,
who was our
intern.
seminary intern at that time. Well, we always accused Bobby of just saying that. But anyway, the day of the retirement party, we went to Foster Golf Course and had them cut a section out of the 9th green where HM had the 2 holes in one. And as one of the gifts that afternoon, we presented him this core that came out of the 9th green at Foster. Well, he immediately planted it next to the sidewalk at their new home up in Edmonds. And every time we would go up to visit him, he would always point out that little round spot of grass in his front yard that came from the Foster Golf Course. That was just another wonderful time in our history. So,
Yeah.
and well, speaking of celebrations, the first one I can recall, we had, of course, taken out a loan from the ALC Mission Investment Fund to fund the first unit. Then we had refinanced to fund this unit. And we had a 40-year loan, but we were making double and triple payments. And lo and behold, in about 20 or 22 years, we had already paid off the loan to build the entire campus that we had at that time. So we decided to have a mortgage burning ceremony. It took place right over here. We had 2 or 3 of our first responders who were in the congregation at that time standing by with fire extinguishers. But we built a pretty good flame over here in the corner. And I was on the board of trustees of the ALC at that time. And George Schultz, Dr. George Schultz, was the executive secretary, and he, of course, was president of the Mission Investment Fund. So I invited George to come to be our guest speaker that day. And then that evening we had a big dinner. You might recall we had it at Dosey's Furniture
I do remember
store in
that.
South Center.
Yeah.
In those days, Dosey's had a big furniture store down there, and they had a large meeting room that was available to community groups and churches. And so that's where we had that celebration. Well, then about 3 years later was our 25th anniversary. And so we decided to celebrate that. And we invited Dr. Preuss, who was then the presiding bishop and the president of the ALC to come. And it was just a wonderful person, or is a wonderful person. He's 94 years old now.
Oh, gosh.
And I still stay in touch with him. And anyway, he was our house guest for Sandy and I, and he got quite ill during the night. And but he was able to get on the airplane and fly back to Minneapolis the next morning because he was anxious. Later that week or early the next week, he had been invited by President Carter to do the opening prayer at an international conference of world leaders in Lisbon, Portugal. Well, lo and behold, when David got back to Minneapolis, he had an appendectomy.
Oh.
And so had to go into the hospital, but he had quick recovery and he was able to get to Lisbon and actually do the opening prayer for that conference. We celebrated that dinner at Glendale, if you remember, in their gymnasium. We needed a big place. Phil Nelson and I put together a slideshow about our history up to that time. And we had fun doing that because we had a soundtrack with it. And we did the soundtrack in Jack McCormick's home sound booth.
Oh.
And so, we repeated that again at the 40th using his sound booth for it too. But so then I recall the next celebration was the 40th. And we needed a large place again, and so we moved to the gymnasium at North Hill School, which 40 years earlier had been the place where this congregation started. One of the features of the 40th was we wanted a 40-voice choir. And that we did have, 40 voices, but to get the 40 voices, we had 4 generations in the choir. We had Thane Baldwin, who was Enid Koning's father. We had Enid, and we had Enid's daughter Mary, and we had Mary's daughter Amelia, who was like less than 1 year old.
Yeah, infant,
So here is Amelia in the choir. Wasn't able to sing yet, but we counted her as the 40th voice of the 40-voice choir for the 40th anniversary. Another great celebration. The 50th we held right here in the church, and we had our meal here at the church too. But we had people eating all over the place, in the narthex even here, because we filled all of the spaces. I'm through the years I was frequently, well, it's only been 15 years ago, I guess, but while Betty Zay was still here before she moved, she would constantly remind me of the fact that I exposed her and Sandy and Joyce Lentz to the rest of the congregation as to how old they were, because I mentioned in my remarks that evening that they were all 3 17-year-old juniors in high school when Principes was started in 1955. So dear Betty has always reminded me of that.
Yeah.
I miss her so much, but I see that she checks in with us all the time on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday evenings. So those were some of the great celebrations we had through the years.
Oh, wonderful celebrations. You're right. You're right. And you were in the middle of planning those with a lot of other folks, you know. So let's see here. Oh, how about telling us about when we had 2 sessions of Sunday school?
Yes, we. Thane Baldwin was the. This is an interesting story about how Pastor Worth operated. Thane Baldwin was the Sunday school superintendent, and I became the assistant Sunday school superintendent. And then after a period of time, Thane decided he wanted to step down or do something different. And so Pastor Orth asked me to come to his office, and he didn't say, Frank, would you consider being the Sunday school superintendent? No, he said, Frank, you are now our Sunday school superintendent. Well, anyway, that was the time when we had so many children, and I remember writing a letter to my mother on Rally Sunday of in the late 60s, maybe mid to late 60s when I became superintendent. Anyway, we had registered on that Sunday morning over 600 children for Sunday school. And we had to move to 2 sessions of Sunday school. We had, in those days, we found 31 different classrooms in the garage to begin with, in the old parsonage, and all over the church, in the kitchen even. We had the kitchen of the old parsonage, and we had the kitchen of the church here. We had Sunday school classes. And we would have a session for 45 minutes right after the 8 o'clock service, and another session at 10 o'clock leading up to the 11 o'clock service.
Right. And at that time, there were classrooms where the offices are now. So those were
Yes.
classrooms as well.
Oh, yes, there were 2 large confirmation classrooms,
Yeah.
108 and 109, where the 3 offices are now, yes. And, well, Julie, you were in confirmation in those days, and I'm sure it was a big class, was it not?
Ours was 12.
12?
They were bigger after that.
Yes, I heard as many as 40 one time.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so again, the neighborhood was different
Yes.
and the congregation was different. So,
Yes.
and then let's see. I had a thought about.
Sunday school. Huh?
Well, anyway, and we had over 60 teachers, and had to have a lot of substitute teachers because there would always be someone sick or something. I remember my Saturday nights were filled with phone calls.
Trying to cover these classes. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, we had a Thursday night school also.
That's right.
And so we had to have teachers for Thursday night too. And Thursday night was choir and the
Family
Thursday
night.
school
Yeah.
and family night. A lot of things happening here on Thursday night. The point that crossed my mind is, I'll switch subjects a little bit here.
That's okay.
Because the call processes were always so interesting. And Sandy and I were on just about every, one of
Yeah.
us or the other, were on every call committee up until this. I'll tell you in a minute. This is an important one. But anyway, we remember when we were calling, this would have been after, well, I don't know, after Pastor Hunter, yes. And I believe we had Nancy Winder as our interim pastor at that time. And so we were in good shape in terms of, and we spent that year, and we had called, first of all, Pastor Rayton from Tucson, Arizona. Wonderful pastor, but family issues there. His children were in high school and early college, and it just wasn't a good time for him to move, and he returned the call. We called a second person, and that person returned our call. And so then Sandy and I were frequently in Fargo, and we had met Pastor Foss and Nancy at First Lutheran in Fargo. And he was a member of a large clergy staff there because they had over 4,000 members.
Oh, wow.
Well, it turned out that the lead pastor was resigning or retiring, and all of the other pastors were on coterminous calls, so they submitted their resignations. And so Rick was without a call. And we have dear friends in Fargo, and they called us and they said, "Are you still in the call process?" And we said yes, and Sandy was on the committee. And they said, "Well, you know, Rick Foss is without call right now." Well, Sandy got busy and discovered that Rick was in a summer session at Princeton University in New Jersey, and there was no good way to contact him. And she got a phone number for a dorm at Princeton where all of these summer students were staying, I guess. And someone answered the phone. It was a payphone in a hallway. And she explained what she wanted, and this person said, "Well, I'll leave a note here by the phone." And so a note was to Rick Foss, "Please call Sandy Jennings in Seattle." And lo and behold, Rick found that note. And he called Sandy, and we quickly made arrangements for Rick to fly from Princeton and for Nancy to fly from Fargo. And they came out here for the interview. In the meantime, Rick had received a call to a church in Rochester, Minnesota, much closer to his parents' home and everything, and closer to where they were living. But once again, you know what happened? He was such a wonderful pastor.
He was.
Yes.
He was.
He wasn't with us as long as we would have liked, because he was called to a big church in Moorhead, Trinity Lutheran, and wasn't there very long until he was called to become the bishop of Eastern North Dakota, where he was for 17 years, and then went on to become president of Lutheran Seminary. And to this day, Rick and Nancy live on Como Avenue, right across from Lutheran Seminary. And we stay in touch with them all the time. And he was
Quite a ride.
It was quite a ride, is right, yeah. So, sorry to get so emotional here.
Oh, it is emotional. You don't have to apologize for that. You know, it's poignant times and good for us to remember.
Yeah.
Good for us to remember. So.
I remember, I think a question that came in was, what about this building? Well, it turns out that the master plan, which was put together rather early in the life of the congregation.
I think so. Yeah, before this was even built.
Before this was built. This was intended to be the fellowship hall.
Right.
And right underneath the altar there, embedded in the concrete, is all kinds of plumbing that was intended to be the new kitchen of the fellowship hall. And a new sanctuary was to be built where the east roadway is here, facing 192nd. Well, of course, that never happened, but that was the original plan, was for a new sanctuary just east of here.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big decision. I think Dad was president or some leadership deal during that time, heading the committee or on the committee to decide whether to.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of work that went into that decision. But in the end, it was a good one.
Yeah.
I think part of the decision was that they thought that spending that kind of money would be better spent in ministry, and
Yes. Well, and so many things happened that changed the neighborhood. the extension of the main runway,
Right.
cut off 192nd to Angle Lake. The freeway cut us off from the valley, really.
Yeah.
And Grace Lutheran Church got started, and 2 or 3 other Lutheran churches got started, and so the whole neighborhood changed before.
It was a different dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm. Forgive me for rambling.
Oh,
I'm thinking of Pastor Oddix. In so many ways, he was so vulnerable, but in such a loving way.
yeah. Well, he would have tears too, Frank, so you're not alone in that.
Yeah.
Coming from a crier myself.
Oh, I know. I can still see him. Well, the pulpit wasn't there; it was over there. But we had to wait a few times for him to erase his emotions too
Right,
when he was
compose
preaching.
himself.
Yeah, but he was older than most of our pastors have been, and I can remember one night on our council meetings seemed to go forever, like they get over about 11 o'clock at night or something. I remember the phone ringing in the kitchen, and he answered it, and it was Bert, and there was some emergency. So here's 11 o'clock at night. Bert comes walking up from the parsonage, and the two of them get in his little VW Bug, and they go wherever they were needed to go that night. And I remember him with his hospital calls. He would go to call on members of the congregation, but if he'd see a door open, he'd just go into a room and visit with whoever might be in there. And it was at Highline Hospital. He started visiting with this lady. I don't remember her name now. And I don't know how many times he might have visited with her, maybe a half a dozen or so. But anyway, and she never came to church here, maybe never got out of the hospital, I don't know. But lo and behold, in her will, she left us about $40,000.
Oh, that's right.
And that's what built the education building, with a lot of volunteer labor, all volunteer labor, but the $40,000 paid for all of the materials to build the education building.
Yeah.
And she never even worshiped here, but our wonderful pastor had called on her, and yeah.
Made that connection.
Oh, and the other story of connections, the one call committee that neither Sandy or I were on was when we called Pastor Tollefson. Well, lo and behold, we come to church that morning and find out that the person we're going to call is Conrad Tollefson. Conrad Tollefson. I poke Sandy. I know the Tollefsons. Yeah. Well, most people know now that Conrad and I grew up on North Dakota farms about 18 miles apart. I'm at least a half a generation older than him, so Conrad and I didn't know each other, but I knew his family. His dad was a very prominent farmer. His dad, first of all, had been a superintendent of schools down in the Red River Valley.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Where they raised all of the potatoes. And then when he decided to move back to the family farm, he was the first farmer up on the plateau to start to raise potatoes. And some of his neighbors started raising potatoes also. Well, that was long ago. The potatoes have given way now to new crops. Canola is the primary crop now that's grown in those areas. But his father was very well known for being the first potato farmer out of the valley up on the plateau. And he was very successful at it. Now Conrad's nephew, Carl Tollefson II, his father was Carl Tollefson, is now on the family farm in Osnabrück, North Dakota. So another connection.
Yeah, yeah. There are lots of connections in this church from the Midwest. So. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I've exhausted my questions. If you can come up with something else you'd like to share, Frank, that'd